Jerry, you're muted.
Beverly, did Jerry want to record himself?
Yes, that would be very pleasant. Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking to myself, I suppose it's no secret who the exception is. Uncle, cry uncle. The public clamors every day, but 51%, it's at least 51% of the public, at least, that pulled the lever for Joe Biden in November. My fellow Toastmasters and most welcome guests. These are indeed, in the words of pamphleteer Thomas Paine, the times that try men's souls. But I'm here to offer some encouraging news on that front. In the annals of presidential concessions, there is plenty of good cheer, that there are numerous examples of humility on display, as well as humility's, sadly, evil twin, arrogance, in these stories of how presidents and their aspirants handle defeat. We also get a dollop of some humor too, which I think is much needed in these times. Let's start from the beginning. We're talking about the nation's first president, George Washington, who was selected with popular acclaim, and he was succeeded by John Adams, a very bookish, studious-looking man with a vinegary sense of humor. And Adams failed in his bid for a second term in what became the second contested election in American history. It was a shrill affair, and Adams and Jefferson, who were formerly cordial, grew distant enough for Adams to choose to go home the morning of the inaugural for Jefferson and retired back to Massachusetts, setting what is perhaps an unfortunate template for future rudeness from presidential aspirants. Adams became the first of eventually 4 presidents who chose not to attend the inaugurations of their successors. So let's fast forward now to 1992. We have, vying for the nation's top spot, William Jefferson Clinton is taking on the incumbent George Herbert Walker Bush, HW for short. And Bush made a fatal miscalculation in the course of his governance. He pledged no new taxes, and unfortunately, his economy ran into a buzzsaw and a war, and he needed to raise taxes, which he did. So he failed to gain re-election, but he did manage to evince a considerable amount of grace under fire. And in his concession speech, he quoted former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and talked about how the vote is conferred on President Bush, the, quote, order of the boot. Of course, boot, you might get it, means the boot out the door. So that's a somewhat of a rare sense of humor on display for someone who suffered a very substantial loss of face and defeat. Now let's move to the hotly contested 2000 election, which featured Tennessee Democrat Al Gore, who reputedly invented the internet, facing off with Texas Republican George W. Bush, HW's son. This contest seesawed back and forth through most of the evening of Election Day, and into the early morning hours, it became apparent that, at least to the pundits, that George Bush had the lead in Florida, which was enough to give him the plurality in electoral votes, and hence the election win. Gore got the same message, called Bush, and told Bush that he congratulated George W. for his apparent victory. Gore, now with his concession speech in hand, was intercepted by his aides, who rushed to tell him that the Florida tally had tightened dramatically and that there were only a few hundred votes separating the two men. Gore then picked up the phone and called W, and the conversation went something like this. Bush, let me make sure I understand. You're calling me back to retract your concession? Gore, you don't have to get snippy about this. Finally, 5 weeks after this conversation, the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, intervened, cut off the voting, the recount, and in effect, making George Bush the winner of the 2000 presidential election. Of course, that necessitated a rewrite by Al Gore onto his earlier concession speech, which included the following. Gore, just moments ago, I spoke with George W. Bush, and I congratulated him on becoming the 43rd president of the United States. And I promised him that this time I wouldn't call him back. Another welcome display of humor under considerable duress. Like Gore, Kansas Senator Bob Dole, a Republican, had the dubious distinction of having to concede twice. In 1976, Bob Dole was the vice presidential candidate with Gerald Ford's in the top spot, and they were defeated by the combine of Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale. On that occasion, after the formal concession speech, Dole was quoted as saying, contrary to reports that I took the loss badly, I want to say that I went home last night and slept like a baby. Every 2 hours, I woke up and cried. 20 years later, Dole had to concede once again, this time failing in his bid to wrest the White House from the aforementioned Bill Clinton. These are but a few examples of how American leaders summoned the dignity to acknowledge their defeats. Americans fight hard to reach the top and give their utmost in toil and treasure. When they stumble, their reward for graciously conceding is a high regard in the eyes of their countrymen. With this, in a democracy comes acknowledgement that a victory for one is ultimately a victory for us all. Madam Toastmaster,